shit! Look, Mom, we're supposedly too big for a cheerleader. Maybe you should start listening to my leadership ideas once in a while.
There are films that define a decade. There are films that rewrite the rules of what cinema can do. And then, once in a very long while, there is a film that does both at the exact same time, in the exact same 2 hours and 17 minutes, and leaves an entire generation of moviegoers sitting in darkened theaters with their jaws somewhere near the floor, trying to figure out what they just witnessed. Terminator 2, Judgment Day is that film. It is a landmark. It is a technical revolution. It is a piece of cinema history so significant that almost everything you see in modern action filmmaking, every liquid metal effect, every relentless chase sequence, every emotionally complex machine protagonist, traces its DNA back to one movie released in the summer of 1991. And yet, when you strip away the spectacle, when you peel back the groundbreaking visual effects and the thundering Hans Zimmer score and the iconic imagery, what you find underneath is a film that is simultaneously more ambitious and more flawed than its reputation suggests. A film that tried to do something genuinely extraordinary and in many ways succeeded, but also a film that carries real weaknesses that the decades of reverence have quietly papered over. That is exactly what we are going to talk about today. All of it. The brilliance, the cracks, the legacy, the deeper meaning, the things you probably missed the first time, and maybe the second time too. Because that is what we do here at the Film Box. We do not just describe movies, we open them up. We look at every layer. We find the things hiding in the corners of the frame that most people walk right past, and we pull them out into the light where you can really look at them. Welcome to the Film Box. If you are new here, genuinely, truly welcome. This channel exists for one kind of person specifically, not the casual viewer, not someone looking for a quick summary. This channel is for the person who finishes a film and immediately wants to talk about it, the person who notices something in the background of a scene and cannot let it go, the person who watches a movie and thinks, wait, what was that really about? What were they actually trying to say? What does that ending mean? If that is you, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Pull up a seat. We are going to go deep on this one. Now, Terminator 2. Let's establish something right from the start, because I think it matters going into this conversation. This film sits at a very particular place in the cultural imagination. It is one of those titles that people do not just like, they hold on to. There is a kind of emotional ownership that generations of viewers feel toward this movie. It shaped childhoods, it defined summers, it became shorthand for a certain kind of cinematic power. And I understand that completely. I genuinely do. The film earns a significant portion of that love. There are sequences in this movie, moments of filmmaking craft, of character work, of pure visceral cinema that are as good as anything the action genre has ever produced. No hesitation on that point. But I am also going to be honest with you today in a way that film coverage of T2 rarely is, because my personal rating for this film sits at 5 out of 10. And before you close this video, stay with me. Because that number is not a dismissal, it is an invitation. It is me saying, I think this film is more interesting, more complicated, and more worth examining when we are willing to look at it clearly, rather than through the filter of nostalgia. A 5 out of 10 from me means this film lands exactly at the midpoint between something that partially works and something that truly soars, and understanding exactly why it does not fully soar. For me, is where the most interesting conversation lives. The gap between what Terminator 2 achieves and what it reaches for is, honestly, one of the most fascinating gaps in all of mainstream cinema. So that is the premise of this video. We are going to honor what this film does brilliantly. We are going to examine what it does not quite pull off. We are going to look at the filmmaking, the cameras, the lenses, the editing, the effects, and understand exactly what James Cameron was attempting on a technical and artistic level. We are going to walk through the story beat by beat. We are going to talk about the cultural moment this film arrived into and what it meant. We are going to dig into the fan theories that have kept this film alive in conversation for over 3 decades. And then, in full spoiler territory, we are going to open the ending completely and talk about what it actually means, what it costs, and whether the film earns the emotional weight it is reaching for. This is a long one, a proper deep dive. If you want the quick take, this is not the video for you, and that is absolutely fine. There are plenty of those out there. But if you want to actually understand Terminator 2, the whole film, the whole story, the context, the craft, the meaning, and the honest assessment of where it stands, then settle in. Get comfortable. Because we are going all the way in. Just before we do, if you have been here before, if the film box is already part of your regular film conversation, then you already know the deal. You know we do not rush these. You know we do not pad them out either. Every minute of this script is going to earn its place. And if you enjoy what we do here, the like button and the subscribe button genuinely help us keep making these. The algorithm on YouTube is a strange and sometimes baffling machine, and every signal you send tells it that deep, serious, thoughtful film coverage is something people actually want. Which, clearly, you do. So if this is the kind of content that makes your day better, let us know. It costs you nothing and it means everything to a channel like ours. Right, enough preamble. Let us talk about a film that showed the world what cinema could look like in the digital age, and asked at the very same time whether the digital age might be the thing that kills us all. Terminator 2 Judgment Day. 1991. James Cameron. $102 million. 2 years of production, one of the most technically ambitious movies ever attempted at that point in film history. And a story built around a question that the first film never had time to ask properly. What happens when the machine becomes something more than a machine? What happens when the killer learns to feel? We are going to answer that question together, layer by layer, scene by scene, detail by detail, because every film is a box, and we open it together. Here is the thing that nobody really stops to think about when they talk about Terminator 2. The thing that, once you sit with it properly, starts to feel almost impossibly bold as a creative decision, almost reckless even. The kind of choice that, if it had gone wrong by even a few degrees, would have destroyed the entire film before the first act was finished. And yet it did not go wrong, it landed. It landed so completely and so convincingly that within about 15 minutes of the film's opening, most audiences had forgotten they were supposed to be afraid of the very thing they were now being asked to cheer for. Think about that for a moment. In 1984, James Cameron introduced the world to the Terminator, and the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger in a performance of ice-cold, machine-precise menace, was one of the most purely terrifying screen villains of the decade. Not terrifying in the way that horror films produce terror, terrifying in a more specific, almost existential way. Because what made the Terminator so frightening in that first film was not that it was big or strong or relentless, though it was all of those things. What made it terrifying was that it could not be reasoned with, it could not be bargained with, it did not feel pity or remorse or fear, it did not stop, ever. It was implacable in the truest sense of the word, a perfect killing machine wearing a human face, hunting a young woman through the streets of Los Angeles with a focus and a patience that felt genuinely inhuman. Because it was. That was the whole point. The original Terminator left audiences with a very specific fear response hardwired into them. Big, strong, Austrian accent, leather jacket, lead eyes in the dark, run. That was the emotional equation. And for 7 years, from 1984 to 1991, that equation sat undisturbed in the cultural memory. Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator meant danger. It meant death. It meant the most frightening kind of predator imaginable. And then James Cameron did something that sounds almost insane when you describe it plainly. He made the Terminator the hero, not just a reformed villain, not a monster who switches sides in the final act. The actual protagonist, the protector, the guardian, the entity that John Connor, the future leader of the human resistance, trusts more completely than almost any human being in the film. The T-800 Model 11, the same chassis, the same face, the same unstoppable physical presence that spent an entire film hunting Sarah Connor, now reprogrammed, sent back through time, tasked not with killing but with protecting. And not just protecting, learning, growing, becoming in the film's own deeply strange and genuinely moving logic, something approaching a father figure. Here is what makes this hook so extraordinary as a piece of storytelling. Cameron did not ease the audience into it. He did not hold your hand through the transition. The opening act of Terminator 2 is constructed as a deliberate misdirect, and it is one of the most precisely engineered pieces of audience manipulation in mainstream cinema history. You watch two figures arrive in 1995 Los Angeles through separate time displacement events. One of them is large, familiar, leather jacket, motorcycle, exactly what you remember from the first film. The other is smaller, leaner, a police officer with a pleasant face and a calm, reasonable manner. And everything, the framing, the editing rhythm, the music, the way Cameron shoots each character in those early scenes, tells you that the familiar one is the threat, and the reasonable one is the authority figure, probably there to help. It is a lie. A beautifully constructed, deliberately sustained cinematic lie, and the moment the film reveals the truth, the moment you realize which of these two figures is hunting John Connor and which one is there to protect him, something remarkable happens in the viewer's nervous system. The fear response does not disappear, it transfers. The dread you had been building toward the T-800 shifts completely onto the T-1000. And in its place, toward Arnold's Terminator, something genuinely unexpected takes root. Something warmer, something almost like relief. That is the hook, that is the trick. That is the creative gamble at the center of this entire film. But here is where it gets even more interesting, because the reversal is not just a plot mechanic. It is not simply a bait and switch to generate surprise. It is the foundation of everything the film is attempting thematically. The entire emotional journey of Terminator 2 depends on you making that transition, on you buying into the T-800 not just as a protector, but as a being capable of something like change, something like attachment, something like sacrifice. If Cameron does not pull off that misdirect in the opening act, if the audience does not make that emotional journey from fear to investment, then the ending of this film means nothing. The tears that millions of people have reportedly shed at the finale of T2 are only possible because of the structural brilliance of those opening sequences. The emotion is earned by the engineering, and here is the detail that makes this even more compelling when you think about it. Arnold Schwarzenegger was, at this point in 1991, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. He was coming off Total Recall. He was arguably at the absolute peak of his cultural moment. His face was synonymous with action cinema in a very specific way. Big, powerful, occasionally quippy, fundamentally on the side of the audience. And Cameron understood that. He understood that Schwarzenegger's star persona, the accumulated goodwill of a decade of audience friendly performances, was actually an asset in pulling off this reversal. Because somewhere in the back of the audience's mind, even during those early scenes where the T-800 seems threatening, there was a quiet voice saying, "But it is Arnold. Arnold does not lose. Arnold does not stay the villain." The star persona and the narrative misdirect were working in harmony, even as they seemed to be in conflict. That is sophisticated filmmaking. That is understanding how cinema works, not just as story, but as cultural event, as the meeting point between a screen and an audience that brings its own knowledge and expectations into the theater. And then there is the other half of the hook. The thing sitting alongside this extraordinary character reversal that almost nobody gives enough credit to. Linda Hamilton. Because while everyone was watching Arnold Schwarzenegger and Robert Patrick, while the conversation was dominated by liquid metal and CGI breakthroughs and $100 million budgets, Linda Hamilton walked into this film and delivered what is arguably one of the most physically and emotionally committed performances in the history of the action genre. Sarah Connor in the first film is a waitress who becomes a warrior. Sarah Connor in the second film is something else entirely. Something harder and sharper and more frightening in a human way than the T-800 ever managed to be in the first film. Hamilton reportedly trained for months, military style, relentlessly, and the results are not just visible in her body but in her eyes, in the way she carries herself through every scene, in the terrifying specificity of her conviction. She is not a hero in the way the genre usually presents heroes. She is something rawer than that, something more damaged. And the film is, for extended stretches, genuinely uncomfortable about what she has become, which is exactly where the most interesting dramatic territory lives. So that is your hook. That is the impossible creative bet at the heart of Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Take the most frightening scream villain of the previous decade, put him at the center of a story about protection, family, and what it means to be human. Construct the entire emotional architecture of a 2 hour plus blockbuster around the question of whether a machine can learn to care. And then, just to make sure you are not going for small stakes, frame that question inside one of the most technically ambitious and visually groundbreaking films ever made, released in the summer of 1991 to an audience that had no idea what they were about to see. That is what Terminator 2 is attempting. That is the gamble. And understanding it, really understanding it, changes every conversation about whether the film succeeds or falls short. The question is not whether it is a great action film, it clearly is, in stretches. The question is whether it is a great film Full stop. And that question is considerably more complicated. Let's find out. Before we step inside the story itself, before we follow John Connor through the streets of Los Angeles and Sarah Connor through the corridors of Pescadero State Hospital and a chrome endoskeleton through the burning wreckage of a steel mill, we need to spend some time behind the camera. Because understanding what it actually took to make Terminator 2 is not just a collection of interesting trivia, it is essential context. The production facts surrounding this film actively change how you see it. They change how you understand specific scenes. They change how you evaluate what is on screen. And in several cases, they reveal a level of commitment from the director, from the cast, from the technical crews that borders on the genuinely extraordinary. So let us open the production box. 5 things that happened behind the camera on Terminator 2 that you need to know before we go any further. The first one begins not on a film set but in a computer laboratory, and it is the fact that arguably changed the history of visual effects more than any single development since the invention of the motion picture camera. By the time James Cameron began serious pre-production on Terminator 2, he had already pushed the boundaries of what computers could do in cinema with The Abyss in 1989, a film that contained the first CGI water creature ever rendered for a major theatrical release. That sequence was roughly 75 seconds long. It took months to create, and Cameron looked at it and thought, this is the beginning of something. What the technology could do. Creating a photorealistic fluid entity that could move and reflect and transform pointed toward the possibility that the Terminator franchise was uniquely positioned to explore. Because the one thing a computer could create more convincingly than almost anything else in 1990 was something that was supposed to look artificial, something that was supposed to look like it was made of a material that did not exist in nature. The T-1000 was born from that realization. Cameron reportedly conceived the liquid metal Terminator specifically because he understood that the emerging CGI technology of the early 90s was approaching the point where it could render a reflective, morphing metallic surface with enough convincingness to sustain a feature film. Not seamlessly, not yet, but close enough if the sequences were designed intelligently and the integration with practical effects was handled with precision. He brought in industrial light and magic, George Lucas's legendary effects house, and what followed was reportedly one of the most technically grueling effects productions in the studio's history. The team developed entirely new rendering software specifically for the T-1000's liquid metal transformation sequences. The famous shot of the T-1000 stepping through prison bars, that single moment, reportedly required months of work and represented a level of photorealistic CGI that simply had not existed in cinema before. But here is the thing that changes how you watch every T-1000 scene in the film. The CGI, groundbreaking as it was, accounts for only a fraction of the T-1000 screen time. The vast majority of what you are watching, the walking, the running, the fighting, the chasing, is Robert Patrick, a human being. And the physical commitment that Patrick brought to that role is so total, so precisely calibrated, that it creates the unsettling quality that makes the T-1000 genuinely frightening in a way that pure CGI alone could never have achieved. Cameron reportedly asked Patrick to study the movement of predatory animals, big cats specifically, and to run at a pace that looked sustainable but felt relentless. Not a sprint, not a lunge. Something steadier, something that communicated that this thing does not get tired, does not overshoot, does not waste energy, just moves toward you, always toward you. Watch the sequence where the T-1000 chases John Connor's dirt bike through the Los Angeles storm drain on foot. Patrick is running at a pace that is fast enough to feel threatening, but controlled enough to feel mechanical. That is not an accident. That is months of preparation for a single tonal quality, the quality of something that will not stop, and it is as much responsible for the T-1000's power on screen as every flame of computer-generated liquid metal. The second production fact takes us to Linda Hamilton. And this is a story that deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in conversations about this film, because what Hamilton did to prepare for the role of Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 was not just impressive by the standards of action movie preparation. It was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. Hamilton reportedly worked with an Israeli military trainer, a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces, for months before filming began. Daily sessions, multiple hours, combining weapons training, combat technique, and the kind of physical conditioning that fundamentally alters how a human body moves and carries itself. She reportedly learned to load and fire a variety of weapons with both hands, to perform tactical movements under physical stress, and to sustain the kind of muscular endurance that would be visible, not just in action sequences, but in the moment to moment way her body occupies space in quieter scenes. And that last part is the critical detail, because the transformation Hamilton underwent is most powerful, not in the scenes where Sarah Connor is running or fighting or shooting. It is most powerful in the scenes where she is still. Watch the sequence in the mental institution. The sequence where Sarah sits across from her psychiatrist, attempting to present as cooperative and stable while internally calculating every variable of her situation. Hamilton's physical stillness in that scene is not passive, it is controlled. Every muscle group that is not required for the conversation is actively quiet in a way that reads as suppressed capability rather than relaxation. That is not something you can fake with costuming or camera angles. That is a body that has genuinely been changed by months of intense physical preparation. And it means that even in the film's most dialogue driven moments, the body of the character is telling a story about who this person has become, a story that is just as important as anything being said out loud. Hamilton reportedly also trained so intensely that she could perform many of the action sequences without a stunt double. Not all of them. Some of the more dangerous physical work still required specialist performers, but enough that the camera could get closer, hold longer, and show you the reality of what this character is doing with a specificity that cuts to stunt double action filmmaking simply cannot provide. Every time you feel like a Sarah Connor action sequence has an unusual rawness to it, a sense of genuine physical stakes, rather than cinematic choreography. That is Hamilton's preparation making itself felt to the screen. The third production fact concerns the budget, and it is one that tells you something important about the relationship between James Cameron and the Hollywood studio system. The original budget agreed upon with distributor TriStar Pictures for Terminator 2 was reportedly in the region of $88 million, which was, at that time, already an enormous sum for a feature film, placing it among the most expensive productions in the history of the medium. By the time the film was completed, the budget had reportedly escalated to somewhere between $94 and $102 million, depending on which accounting methodology you use. It was by most reckonings the most expensive film ever made at the time of its release. Now, the interesting part of this fact is not the number itself, it is what the number was spent on. Because the budget overruns on Terminator 2 were not the result of studio excess or wasteful production management in the conventional Hollywood sense. They were the result of James Cameron pursuing technical ambitions that the budget had not fully accounted for because those technical ambitions had never been attempted before. The CGI sequences alone reportedly consumed a significant portion of the additional cost. Not because ILM was inefficient, but because the work they were doing required developing new tools, new workflows, and new technical infrastructure that simply did not exist prior to this production. You cannot budget accurately for something that has never been done, and Cameron reportedly was not willing to compromise on the technical standard he had set for those sequences, even when it became clear that meeting that standard would require more money than had been originally allocated. The result is that Terminator 2 is a film whose visual effects sequences are genuinely more sophisticated than its budget should have been able to produce. Because the people making it invented new ways of making things in the process of making it. When you watch the T-1000 reform from a puddle of liquid metal on a tile floor, you are not just watching a visual effect, you are watching the birth of a new technical vocabulary. And that changes how you see it. The fourth production fact takes us out onto the streets, specifically onto the Los Angeles freeway system and into the concrete storm drain channels of the Los Angeles River. Because Terminator 2 made extensive use of real locations in a way that large scale action filmmaking rarely does, and the decision to shoot practical wherever possible had a profound effect on the film's texture and credibility. The famous freeway chase sequence, where a heavily armed Sarah Connor, John Connor, and the T 800 attempt to escape while the T 1000 pursues in a liquid nitrogen truck, was shot on actual Los Angeles freeways. Reportedly, sections of the freeway were temporarily closed for filming, and the practical danger of working on a real road environment with real heavy vehicles added a weight and a physicality to the sequence that pure studio work cannot replicate. The Los Angeles River storm drain sequences are even more significant in this regard. The storm drain is a genuinely strange and specific environment. Miles of concrete channel designed to move water out of the city quickly, flat and gray and vast, with a quality that is simultaneously very real and slightly alien. Cameron reportedly fell in love with it as a location because it gave him a contained, distinctive space that still felt massive, a kind of urban canyon that could funnel the chase energy of the sequence without requiring massive set construction. And when you watch John Connor on his dirt bike moving through that space with the T 1000 in pursuit, the environment is doing enormous amounts of emotional work. It feels like a place where normal rules do not apply, a place outside the city but inside it, a place between worlds, which is not coincidentally exactly where the film's story lives. The fifth and final production fact for this layer is one that very directly changes how you watch the film's entire final act, and it concerns a creative decision that James Cameron reportedly made early in the development of the sequel and held to with considerable conviction throughout the production. In Terminator 2, the T 800 Arnold Schwarzenegger's character does not kill a single human being. It shoots people, it hits people, it runs people over with vehicles. It creates extraordinary amounts of carnage and physical mayhem. But in a film set, in a world where weapons fire is essentially constant for extended stretches of the second and third acts, every human being on screen survives. The T 800 reportedly shoots people in the legs, aims for non fatal wounds, uses violence as a tool of deterrence and delay rather than elimination. This decision, which required extensive coordination between Cameron, the stunt teams, and the practical effects departments to execute convincingly across dozens of different sequences, is so carefully implemented that most viewers do not consciously register it on a first watch. You are so caught up in the momentum and the noise and the spectacle that the absence of death in what appears to be an extremely lethal environment does not fully land as a deliberate choice. But it is. It is a deeply deliberate choice, and it serves the film's thematic argument in a way that becomes fully visible only when you reach the finale. Because if the T-800 has not killed anyone throughout the film, if it has demonstrated, scene by scene, that a machine built for termination has chosen restraint, chosen a different path, learned a different set of values, then the ending means something specific. The sacrifice at the conclusion of the film is not just a dramatic beat. It is the logical culmination of a transformation that the no-kill rule has been quietly documenting from the moment the T-800 fired its first shot into a human leg rather than a human chest. The machine has been learning what human life is worth throughout every action sequence. The ending is where that learning is finally tested at its highest possible cost. Understanding that Cameron built that thematic argument into the film's action sequences, not just into the dialogue, not just into the emotional scenes between the T 800 and John Connor, but into the specific tactical choices of every gunfight and every chase, changes how every action sequence in the film feels. The spectacle and the theme are not separate things in Terminator 2. They are running on the same track at the same time. And that, more than the budget, more than the CGI, more than any individual technical achievement, is the production fact that defines what James Cameron was actually attempting with this film. He was not just making an action movie, he was making an argument. And he was making it in every frame. Terminator 2 Judgment Day, 1991. Directed by James Cameron. Distributed by TriStar Pictures. Runtime approximately 137 minutes in its theatrical cut, with an extended special edition running closer to 154 minutes. Rated R. Released on July 3, 1991 in the United States, positioned deliberately as a summer blockbuster aimed at the peak of the season's commercial heat and designed from the ground up to be an event. Not just a movie, an event. James Cameron directs from a screenplay he co-wrote with his frequent collaborator William Wisher Jr., the same writing partnership responsible for the original 1984 Terminator. Cameron also serves as producer alongside BJ Rack and Stephanie Austin, with Gail Ann Hurd, who produced the first film, not returning for the sequel. The film was produced through Cameron's own Lightstorm Entertainment in association with Carolco Pictures, the independent studio that was, at this point in the early 90s, one of the most aggressive financiers of large-scale action cinema in the world. Carolco's willingness to back Cameron's escalating budget demands was central to the film getting made at the scale Cameron required, and the company's financial exposure on T2 was, reportedly, significant enough to contribute to the pressures that would eventually lead to Carolco's own financial difficulties later in the decade. The cast anchors around four central performances. Arnold Schwarzenegger returns as the T-800, the Cyberdyne Systems Model 101 Terminator, the same physical chassis as the villain of the first film, now reprogrammed to protect rather than terminate. Linda Hamilton returns as Sarah Connor, older, harder, more frightening, and more damaged than the young woman we met in 1984, now incarcerated in the Pescadero State Hospital after a failed attempt to blow up a computer factory. Edward Furlong makes his feature film debut as John Connor, the teenage version of the future resistance leader, currently living in foster care in Los Angeles, unaware that a machine has been sent back through time specifically to find and kill him. And Robert Patrick takes on the role of the T-1000, the advanced liquid metal Terminator sent from a darker future to finish what the first Terminator failed to do. The supporting cast includes Joe Morton as Miles Bennett Dyson, a Cyberdyne Systems engineer whose work on a recovered Terminator chip is, unknown to him, directly responsible for the technological catastrophe that the film is trying to prevent. As Epatha Mackerson appears as Dyson's wife, Castulo Guerra plays Enrique Salceda, a contact of Sarah Connors from her pre-incarceration past, and Boone returns as Dr. Hunter, Peter Silberman, the psychiatrist who appeared in the first film, whose calm professional certainty about Sarah Connor's delusions becomes one of the film's sharpest pieces of dramatic irony. The genre designation for Terminator 2 is, on its surface, straightforward science fiction action, but that designation undersells the film's ambitions considerably, and it is worth unpacking what kind of story this actually is at its heart, because the marketing, which leaned heavily and understandably on spectacle, somewhat obscured the more complicated emotional architecture underneath. Terminator 2 is, at its core, a film about three broken people and one machine attempting to become a family in the shadow of an apocalypse that only they know is coming. It is a film about a mother who has sacrificed her sanity in the service of a mission that everyone around her believes is a delusion. It is a film about a child who has grown up knowing he is destined for something enormous, but has received none of the love or stability that might equip him for it. And it is a film about a machine that was built to kill learning, piece by piece, what it might mean to protect something, not because it has been programmed to, but because it has come to understand why protection matters. Beneath the chase sequences and the gunfights and the liquid metal transformations, that is the story. A family story. A story about what parents owe their children and what children owe their parents and what any of us owe the future. The science fiction framework, the time travel, the killer robots, the nuclear fate of humanity is the container. The emotional content inside that container is considerably more intimate than the spectacle suggests. Why does this film exist? The honest answer operates on two levels simultaneously. On the commercial level, the original Terminator was a significant financial success and a genuine cultural phenomenon, and by the late 1980s, the appetite for a sequel was substantial. Cameron himself had moved on to other projects, Aliens in 1986, The Abyss in 1989, but The Terminator remained his most iconic creation, and the commercial logic of returning to it with a larger budget and more advanced technology was difficult to ignore. Carolco Pictures was specifically willing to finance the kind of budget that would allow Cameron to realize the sequel at a scale that the first film, made for $6 million, could never have approached. But on the artistic level, and this matters because it shapes the film you are actually watching, Cameron reportedly wanted to return to the Terminator universe specifically because he had an idea that genuinely excited him as a filmmaker rather than simply as a property holder. The idea of flipping the T-800, of taking the most frightening element of the first film and repositioning it as a protector, as a surrogate father figure, as the unexpected emotional anchor of a story about a fractured family, was the creative engine that reportedly drove Cameron's desire to make this sequel rather than simply license the concept to someone else. He wanted to do something specific, something that the franchise framework would enable, but that required a genuine creative investment to execute. And the evidence suggests that he made that investment fully. The spoiler free verdict, then, before we go any deeper. Terminator 2, Judgment Day is a film of extraordinary technical achievement and genuine emotional ambition that does not fully deliver on either of those things with complete consistency. It is spectacular in the truest sense of the word. It creates spectacles that were genuinely unprecedented at the time of its release and that still carry weight more than 3 decades later. It contains performances, particularly from Hamilton, that are far more layered and committed than the action genre typically demands or rewards. It has sequences, individual scenes, and extended passages that represent some of the finest sustained filmmaking in the action genre's history. And yet, there is something in the film that pulls back from its own emotional depth at key moments, something in the writing that occasionally retreats into crowd pleasing sentiment when it could have pushed further into the more uncomfortable places the story was opening up. The film that Terminator 2 sometimes is, in its quieter moments, in its best scenes, in the spaces between the action, is more interesting than the film it consistently is across its entire runtime. That gap is not large enough to make this a bad film, and it is not small enough to be easily dismissed. It is a significant gap, and living inside that gap, honestly and carefully, is where the most worthwhile conversation about this movie actually happens. We are going to have that conversation. All of it, starting right now. Let me be honest with you about something. When I first sat down with Terminator 2, properly sat down with it, with the intention of really watching it rather than simply experiencing it as the cultural artifact it had already become by the time it entered my life, I came to it loaded. And I mean that in the specific way that every film lover understands. I came to it with 7 years of accumulated mythology already sitting on my shoulders. 7 years of people telling me what this film was, what it meant, how it would make me feel. I had heard a superlative so many times, from so many directions, that by the time the opening frames appeared on screen, I had already built a version of this movie in my head, assembled from quotes and references and second-hand descriptions and cultural osmosis. And that version was enormous. Possibly too enormous for any actual film to inhabit. That is a specific kind of problem that only exists for certain films. The ones that arrive in the culture with such force that they become legendary before most people have actually seen them. And Terminator 2, by the time I encountered it, had achieved exactly that status. It was not just a film anymore, it was a benchmark, a reference point, the thing people compared other things to. And all of that weight, all of that accumulated expectation was sitting right there in the room with me when the screen went dark and the music began. The first thing that hits you is the score. Brad Fiedler's main theme, that mechanical, percussive, industrial pulse, lands before you have seen a single image, and it does something very specific to your nervous system. It prepares you for something relentless, something that does not slow down or soften. The rhythm of that theme is the rhythm of a machine in motion, and it communicates the film's central preoccupation, the presence and the nature of machines, before a single actor has appeared on screen. I remember thinking, this is confident. This is a film that knows exactly what it is from the very first second, and then the opening image. The playground, children playing in the afternoon sun, swings and laughter and the warm, golden, ordinary texture of childhood. It is a disarmingly gentle image for a film of this kind. Peaceful, almost innocent. And then the fire comes. A nuclear shock wave rolls across the landscape, and the playground burns, and the children burn with it, and the peaceful afternoon becomes a vision of absolute annihilation, so sudden and so complete that it lands as a genuine shock even when you know it is coming. Sarah Connor's voice arrives over the destruction, measured, controlled, almost clinical, describing the fate of 3 billion human lives on August 29, 1997, with a specificity that makes the apocalypse feel not like a science fiction concept but like a recorded fact, like history that has already happened and is simply waiting to be witnessed. I walked in expecting spectacle. I expected the version of this film that the reputation had built for me. Big, loud, relentless, triumphant. The definitive action blockbuster. And what the first 10 minutes actually delivered was something I had not prepared myself for at all. Something bleaker, something more unsettled. The future war sequences that follow the playground, the skull crushing landscapes, the human resistance fighters moving through rubble and darkness, the hunter killer machines sweeping the ground with searchlights. These do not feel like exciting science fiction vistas. They feel like a nightmare. They feel like something genuinely wrong with the world, something that has gone catastrophically and irreversibly off track, and the weight of that wrongness sits in the atmosphere of those early scenes in a way that I found unexpectedly affecting. What the film gave me in those opening minutes was dread, not excitement, dread, and that surprised me because the reputation of Terminator 2 had not prepared me for a film that could hold that specific emotional register, the register of genuine horror at what humanity might become, at what we might be capable of building and then losing control of. The first act of this film is, in its quietest moments, a film about the apocalypse, in a way that the more frenzied middle sections sometimes push aside. And I found those quieter, darker moments more compelling than I had expected to. Then John Connor arrives. And here is where my experience of the film became genuinely complicated in a way I had not anticipated. Edward Furlong's performance as the teenage John Connor is one of the most discussed aspects of this film, and the discussion usually lands somewhere between effective enough and a minor revelation for its time. What I found, sitting with it fresh, was something more mixed than either of those assessments. Furlong brings a genuine quality to certain scenes, a naturalistic, unpolished quality that feels authentically adolescent in a way that more conventionally trained child actors sometimes miss. But the character as written is, in significant stretches of the film, genuinely difficult to connect with. The early John Connor is reckless in a way that reads as stupid rather than brave, reactive in a way that generates narrative momentum but not emotional investment, and the arc from that version of the character to the version who weeps over the T-800's fate at the film's conclusion requires a degree of dramatic compression that the film does not always earn scene by scene. I noticed that. I noticed it clearly on that first proper watch, and it created a specific friction in my experience of the film. A friction between the emotional journey the film was asking me to take and the extent to which the character work was giving me sufficient reason to make that journey. I wanted to feel what the film was building toward. I could see the destination, but the road there was, at certain points, less carefully constructed than the spectacle surrounding it suggested. The moment that genuinely hooked me, the moment that shifted something in my engagement with the film from observation to genuine investment, was not, interestingly, any of the action sequences. It was a quieter scene. It was the moment in the mental institution where Sarah Connor, sitting across from her psychiatrist, tells him what she knows about the future with the precise, controlled delivery of someone who has made peace with not being believed. Hamilton in that scene is extraordinary in a way that snuck up on me completely. There is no hysteria, no desperation, no attempt to persuade, just a woman stating facts about the end of the world with the kind of calm that can only come from complete certainty, from having lived inside that knowledge for so long that it has calcified into something harder and quieter than fear. The scene is frightening in a very specific way, not because of what Sarah Connor is saying, but because of how she is saying it. Because the absence of emotion is more disturbing than any amount of emotional display would have been. That scene is where the film revealed itself to me as something more than its marketing had suggested. That scene said, "This is a film about what it costs to know something true that the world refuses to accept. This is a film about the particular madness of being right when everyone around you has decided you are wrong. And that is not an action movie theme, that is something considerably more interesting." The atmosphere of Terminator 2 in those early sections is a very precise mixture of two things that do not usually share the same space comfortably: a kind of doom laden grandeur, a sense that the stakes being established are genuinely enormous, and a grimy street level specificity about the texture of early 90s Los Angeles that drowns all that grandeur in something recognizably human. The film does not take place in a fantasy world. It takes place in convenience stores and shopping malls and psychiatric hospitals and suburban neighborhoods. The mundane and the apocalyptic sit right next to each other throughout, and that juxtaposition, that constant friction between the ordinary world and the catastrophic knowledge that hangs over it, is one of the things the film does most consistently well. I walked in expecting to be dazzled, and I was in moments. The effect sequences, even viewed across the distance of several decades, retain a visceral impact that few of their contemporaries have matched. But what I did not expect, what the reputation had not prepared me for, was the specific melancholy that runs through this film like a current beneath the spectacle. This sense that even if these characters win, even if they stop the apocalypse, something will have been permanently lost in the winning, something will have been burned away. That quality, the elegia quality of a film about preventing a tragedy that has already shaped everyone in it, is not what the summer blockbuster label leads you to expect. And it was that quality, more than any individual action sequence, that kept me watching, that made me want to see where the film was going, that made me lean forward rather than back in those first 10 minutes. The box was open. I was already inside it. There is a specific quality to the way Terminator 2 looks that is almost impossible to describe accurately without getting into the technical details of how it was shot, because the visual language Cameron built for this film is not decorative. It is not a collection of aesthetic choices made because they look good in isolation. Every significant technical decision in the cinematography, the editing, the sound design, and the color approach serves a specific narrative and emotional function. And understanding those decisions, really understanding them, changes the experience of watching the film in a way that is difficult to unsee once you have seen it. The director of photography on Terminator 2 is Adam Greenberg, who also shot the original Terminator and would go on to collaborate with Cameron again. The visual continuity between the two films is deliberate and meaningful. Cameron wanted the world of T2 to feel like the same world as the 1984 film, expanded in scale but consistent in texture. But within that continuity, there are significant technical evolutions that Greenberg and Cameron developed specifically for this production, and the most important of them concerns the relationship between light and shadow. Look at the way the film handles darkness. Not just night scenes, the entire approach to shadow and illumination throughout the film. Terminator 2 is visually a film that exists in a state of permanent partial darkness. Even in daylight sequences, even in the most brightly lit exterior scenes, there is a quality to the light that feels slightly occluded, slightly filtered, as though a layer of opacity has been applied between the sun and the world. This is not accidental. Greenberg reportedly worked with Cameron to establish a color temperature and a lighting approach that would communicate subliminally without the audience consciously processing it. The presence of the nuclear shadow. The world of T2 is a world that is living under a death sentence it does not know about. The light reflects that. The light is what healthy light looks like when something is slightly wrong with it. This approach is most visible and most powerful in the nightmare sequences. The scenes where Sarah Connor experiences her visions of nuclear annihilation. The transition from the ordinary visual register of the present day scenes into those nightmare sequences is managed not just through editing but through a dramatic shift in the film's entire chromatic language. The nightmare sequences are bleached, desaturated, overexposed. The light in them is not golden or warm but white and absolute, the kind of light that does not illuminate but obliterates. The transition from the warmer, more naturalistic light of the real world into that annihilating whiteness communicates the nuclear threat not as a political idea or a science fiction concept, but as a sensory experience. You do not just understand that a nuclear detonation would destroy everything. In those sequences, you feel what that kind of light would feel like from the outside. And then, in the most harrowing cut of the sequence, from the inside. The editing structure of those nightmare sequences is worth examining separately because it represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of temporal manipulation in the film. Cameron and his editor Conrad Buff built those sequences through a technique of accelerating compression, beginning with relatively normal cuts, gradually shortening the intervals between images until the editing rhythm itself becomes an approximation of what it might feel like for perception to collapse under the pressure of something too enormous to process. By the time the playground has caught fire and the nuclear shock wave is moving across the landscape, the cuts are coming so fast that the sequence is functioning less like conventional narrative editing and more like a sensory assault. You are not watching events unfold, you are experiencing the breakdown of the ability to watch events unfold. And that distinction between watching and experiencing is precisely what Cameron is reaching for in those moments. The camera language throughout the rest of the film operates according to a set of principles that are considerably more disciplined than the frenetic energy of the set pieces might initially suggest. Cameron and Greenberg make extensive use of what might be described as a two-register shooting approach, a clear visual distinction between the way machines are shot and the way humans are shot. Pay attention to how the T-800 is framed across the film. In the early sequences, before the character's emotional complexity has been established, Cameron shoots the T-800 from angles that emphasize physical mass and implacability, low angles that make the figure loom, wide lenses that distort the edges of the frame slightly and create a quality of oppressive presence. The camera is slightly afraid of the T-800 in those early scenes. It keeps a respectful distance. It shoots upward. Watch what happens to that approach as the film progresses. As the T-800 develops its relationship with John Connor, as the emotional intelligence of the character begins to emerge through the writing and through Schwarzenegger's performance, the camera gradually migrates toward the T-800's eye level. The low angles diminish. The shots become less imposing and more intimate. The camera begins to shoot the T-800 the way it shoots the human characters at a human scale in human space. This is not a subtle transition. It happens across dozens of individual shots spread across the film's entire second act, but it operates below the threshold of conscious perception for most viewers. You feel it before you see it. The T-800 begins to feel less threatening, not just because the narrative is telling you it is less threatening, but because the camera is gradually removing the visual signals that communicated threat in the first place. By contrast, the D1000 is always shot with a quality of unease that never fully resolves. Robert Patrick is a slender, relatively unremarkable physical presence compared to Schwarzenegger, and Cameron uses that contrast deliberately. The T1000 is framed in ways that emphasize its ordinariness, its ability to blend into the visual landscape of the frame. It does not loom, it does not impose, it appears. It is simply there, suddenly, in a space where it was not a moment before, and the camera registers its presence with a quality of mild wrongness rather than overt threat. A police uniform walking calmly through a hospital corridor, a pleasant-faced man standing at the end of a street. The threat is in the calm. The threat is in how completely this entity understands how to occupy human space without disturbing it, until the moment it decides to. The lens choices across the film are worth your attention in another specific way. Cameron and Greenberg use longer focal lengths in the film's more emotionally intimate scenes. The conversations between the T-800 and John Connor, the scenes of Sarah Connor's introspection, the quieter dialogue exchanges that carry the film's thematic weight. Longer focal lengths compress the spatial relationship between subjects, drawing background and foreground closer together and creating a quality of claustrophobic intimacy. They also flatten the field of view slightly, which has the perceptual effect of making faces loom larger and more present in the frame, more difficult to look away from, more unavoidable as objects of emotional engagement. In the scenes where the film is asking you to feel something rather than simply watch something, the lenses physically change to make feeling something easier. The technical apparatus is working in service of the emotional goal. The action sequences, by contrast, employ considerably wider lens choices and more mobile camera work, handheld or on rigs that allow the camera to move with the action rather than simply recorded from a fixed position. The stone drain chase sequence is a particularly strong example of this. The camera in that sequence is perpetually slightly off balance, following the movement of the vehicles with a quality of barely controlled momentum that puts you inside the chase rather than watching it from the outside. You feel the speed not just because the vehicles are moving fast, but because the camera itself seems to be struggling to keep up to maintain its composure in the face of something that is moving too fast for composure. That subjective quality of barely managed pursuit is a specific editorial and cinematographic achievement, and it is why that sequence has a kinetic energy that still feels genuinely exciting rather than merely busy. The sound design of Terminator 2 deserves its own extended examination because it is doing work that the visual spectacle tends to overshadow. Gary Ridstrom, who supervised the sound design, built the audio landscape of this film around a specific principle that machines and humans should sound fundamentally different, not just in what sounds they make, but in the quality and texture of those sounds they make, but in the quality and texture of those sounds. The T-800's footsteps, the hydraulic suggestion of its movement, the particular quality of its voice processing. These are not naturalistic sounds. They are slightly wrong in a way that you observe subconsciously without consciously identifying. And the T-1000 sounds are different again, quieter, more liquid, with a quality of wrongness that is less mechanical than biological. Something that should not be making the sounds it makes. Brad Fiedel's score operates in direct relationship with this sound design approach. The main theme, that clockwork, mechanically precise rhythmic pulse, is built from electronic sounds that deliberately blur the boundary between music and sound effect. Is that a snare drum or a metal impact? Is that a synthesizer pad or an industrial machine? The ambiguity is intentional. The score does not sit above the sound design as a separate emotional layer. It infiltrates it, merges with it, until the music and the environmental sound are working together as a single unified field of audio information that keeps the mechanical, inhuman quality of the world alive, even in scenes where no machines are visually present. And there is one more technical achievement in this film that deserves specific acknowledgement before we move forward, because it is something that the CGI spectacle consistently overshadows in the conversation about T2's technical accomplishments. The practical effects work, the pyrotechnics, the physical stunt choreography, the mechanical effects that were built and deployed on set rather than added in post-production. Terminator 2 is not a film that outsourced its physicality to computers. The CGI sequences are genuinely a small fraction of the film's total runtime, and for the vast majority of what you are watching, the impacts and the explosions and the destruction are real. Things are actually burning, vehicles are actually colliding. The steel mill environment of the final act is actually hot and loud and physically dangerous in a way that the camera is recording rather than constructing. That commitment to practical physicality, to building real things and destroying them in front of real cameras, is what gives the CGI sequences their specific power when they arrive. Because the baseline visual register of the film is so consistently grounded in physical reality, the moments when reality is bent by the T-1000's liquid metal transformations feel genuinely wrong in the right way. They feel like a violation of the rules that the rest of the film has established. And that sense of violation, of something impossible intruding into a world that otherwise operates by real world physics, is what makes those sequences frightening rather than simply impressive. The practical and the digital work together because they work in contrast with each other. Take away the commitment to practical effects and you lose the context that makes the CGI mean something. That is the technical language of Terminator 2. Not just a collection of impressive tools, but a coherent visual and auditory argument, a way of using the specific capabilities of cinema to put the audience inside a particular emotional and perceptual experience rather than simply showing them events from the outside. Every frame of this film is arguing something, and now that we know what it is arguing technically, we can go inside the story and see what it is arguing dramatically. The story of Terminator 2 Judgment Day begins, as all the most important stories do, at the end of the world. Not the world ending, the world that has already ended. The future that exists on the other side of a single catastrophic date, August 29th, 1997, Judgment Day, the day that Skynet, an artificial defense network built by Cyberdyne Systems and handed control of the United States nuclear arsenal, achieves self awareness, determines that humanity represents a threat to its continued existence, and launches the missiles. 3 billion people die in the first exchange. The survivors emerge into a world of ash and ruin and begin a war against the machines that Skynet sends to finish what the bomb started. And from that war, one figure emerges as the leader of the human resistance, one person around whom the scattered survivors organize their defiance, John Connor. This is the world that the film opens onto, not as a storytelling convenience or a piece of expository throat clearing, but as an emotional foundation. Cameron wants you to feel the weight of this future before you meet any of the characters who are trying to prevent it. He wants the apocalypse to be real to you, tangible, specific, devastating, so that everything that follows carries the gravity it deserves. And the future war sequences that open the film accomplish that in a relatively brief amount of screen time through the sheer visual and emotional force of what they depict. This is not a sanitized science fiction future, it is a charnel house. It is what the world looks like when the machines win. Two time displacement events happen within minutes of each other in 1995 Los Angeles. The film handles them with precise economy. We do not need lengthy explanations of how time travel works because the first film already established the mechanism, and Cameron trusts his audience to carry that knowledge forward. What matters is not the mechanics of the arrival, what matters is what arrives. And what arrives, as we have already discussed, is deliberately designed to mislead you about which of the two incoming figures is the threat. We follow John Connor first, 15 years old, living in the San Fernando Valley with foster parents named Todd and Janelle. People who are doing the bare minimum of parenting while clearly resenting even that. John is not a happy adolescent. He is not a well adjusted kid who happens to have an unusual destiny. He is a product of his circumstances, abandoned essentially by a mother who was institutionalized when he was still young, raised by a series of foster placements that taught him self reliance because they did not offer much else, and carrying the accumulated weight of a childhood spent being told that his mother was insane and that the things she believed, the things she tried to prepare him for, were delusions. He rides his dirt bike. He steals cash from ATMs using tricks his mother taught him. A deeply specific detail, the criminal skills passed down from parent to child alongside the apocalyptic warnings, and one that tells you everything about what kind of childhood this was. He is angry. He is resourceful. He is, in almost every conventional sense, not ready for what is coming. Meanwhile, Sarah Connor is in the Pescadero State Hospital under the care of Dr. Rita, Peter Sillerman. She has been there long enough for the institution to feel like a second skin. She knows its rhythms, its personnel, its vulnerabilities, and she has been inside her own mind long enough to know that the exterior she presents to Silverman, the cooperative patient, the woman who has accepted treatment and is working toward integration, is a performance. Not an entirely dishonest one because she genuinely wants to leave. But the beliefs that landed her here have not changed. The apocalypse is still coming. Skynet is still going to happen. She is still the mother of the future leader of humanity. None of that has softened in the years of institutionalization. If anything, the confinement has compressed it, made it harder, more concentrated, more absolutely certain. The T-1000 finds John Connor first, walks into his life wearing the face of a police officer, the figure of institutional authority, the representative of the world that has decided Sarah Connor is dangerous, and John Connor needs to be protected from her. And there is a layer of dark irony in their disguise that the film does not underline, but trusts you to feel. The thing that has come to kill John Connor is wearing the uniform of the system that claimed to be keeping him safe. The T-1000 does not need to force its way into John's world. The world has already built a structure of authority and oversight around John that the T-1000 can simply inhabit. The T-800 finds John next, and the misdirect that Cameron has been sustaining begins to crack in the film's first major action sequence, a motorcycle arcade, a service corridor, a car park. The T-800 and the T-1000 converge on John simultaneously from opposite directions, and in the chaos of that convergence, John has to make a decision about which entity is the threat. The film lets him make the wrong choice first, because of course he does. Everything he can see tells him to run from the large, intimidating figure in the leather jacket and toward the calm, authoritative figure in the police uniform. And it is only when the T-800 physically intervenes, positions itself between John and the T-1000, deploys its weapons, that the truth of the situation begins to register. But even then, John does not fully understand what is happening, and this is one of the things the script handles well in the early sections, the gradual, earned nature of John's comprehension. He does not immediately believe that the machine his mother warned him about has been sent to protect him. He is terrified of the T-800 for an extended period after the initial encounter, and the T-800's communication with him during this period is so functional, so stripped of anything that could be mistaken for reassurance, that it does not help John feel safer so much as it provides him with information he needs to survive. The T-800 explains without warmth and without embellishment that it has been sent back to protect him, that the other machine, the T-1000, is an advanced prototype, that its mission is John's survival. The decision to go to Pescadero, to break Sarah Connor out of the mental institution, is John's idea, not the T-800's, and that matters enormously, because it establishes something fundamental about who John Connor is, even in this damaged, underprepared adolescent form. When he is given the information he needs, he moves toward the people he loves rather than away from danger. He does not choose the safe option. He has a machine that is programmed to keep him alive. He has a bike and a road and the opportunity to put as much distance between himself and the T-1000 as possible, and he turns toward his mother instead. It is the first genuinely heroic thing we see him do. And heroism in this film is consistently framed not as the absence of fear, but as the choice to act on love despite fear. The Pescadero sequence is where the film's most interesting dramatic collision occurs. The collision between the Sarah Connor who exists in John's memory and the Sarah Connor who exists in reality by 1995. John has spent years defending his mother to foster parents and counselors and anyone else who used the word crazy about her. He has carried her in his imagination as something, someone, a fixed point. And then he walks into Pescadero and sees what she has actually become. The physical transformation is startling enough. Hamilton's body in those scenes carries the specific quality of someone who has converted grief and fear and certainty into muscle and motion, and it is not an entirely comfortable thing to look at. But it is the emotional temperature of the reunion that is most telling. Sarah Connor sees the T-800 and her response is immediate, visceral, and completely rational given what she has been through. She wants nothing to do with it. She tries to escape without the machine. She does not want its protection. She has spent enough of her life being shaped and traumatized by the Terminator franchise to have any interest in accepting another machine into her world. And then she sees John, and something shifts, something complex and painful. The love of her mother for a child she has not been able to protect, complicated by the awareness of everything she has sacrificed and everything she has become in the name of protecting him, and the crushing weight of seeing him standing there in front of her looking simultaneously like the child she remembers and like a stranger. Hamilton plays this reunion with extraordinary precision. There is no simple joy in it. There is relief and love and grief and guilt, and the specific kind of complicated maternal feeling that comes from knowing you could not give your child what they deserved. They escape Pescadero, barely. The T-1000 in pursuit is genuinely frightening here, in the specific way that the film establishes most clearly in these middle sequences. It does not panic, it does not rage. It reassesses, it finds another path. It is always over behind them, patient and precise, and the gap between its capabilities and their own is never fully closed, no matter how well they perform. The desert safe house sequence is where the film takes its first real breath. The action drops away and the drama moves into a different register. Quieter, more complicated, more internally focused. Sarah Connor, John Connor, and the T-800 arrive at the desert compound of Enrique Salceda and his family, and in this environment, off the grid, out of immediate danger, the relationships between the three central figures begin to be negotiated rather than simply reactive. The T-800 begins to respond to John's questions, not because it is programmed to be emotionally available, but because John keeps asking. And the T-800's answers, functional literal stripped of social convention, begin to reveal something about the character that John finds both funny and unexpectedly moving. He starts to teach the machine how to smile, how to gesture, how to speak in ways that do not immediately communicate that something is fundamentally wrong with you. And the T-800 absorbs these lessons with a sincerity that is here is the word, the right word, touching. Not because machines touching is a comedic novelty, because the willingness to learn, the openness to change, the interest in connection, these are the most human qualities this film has to offer, and they are being displayed not by a human, but by a machine that does not fully understand why they matter, which makes them matter more. Sarah Connor watches this happening, watches her son, her damaged, brilliant, self-reliant son, forming what appears to be a genuine attachment to a machine. And something breaks open in her, not immediately and not simply. With the sight of her child finding something like a father figure in the T-800 illuminates, with painful clarity, the specific cost of the life she chose. She chose the mission. She chose to prepare John for a future that most of the world was convinced was not coming, and in choosing that she was not able to give him the ordinary things, the ordinary safety, the ordinary warmth. And now a machine is giving him something she could not. The T-800 is a better protector for John in certain specific ways than his mother has been able to be. The film does not say this cruelly. It says it honestly, and honesty, even when it hurts, is always more interesting than comfort. The decision to go after Miles Dyson is the darkest turn the film makes in its second act, and it is the moment that most clearly complicates Sarah Connor as a protagonist rather than simply presenting her as a heroine. Sarah Connor wakes in the night from another nuclear nightmare, and in the clarity of terror, the logic of prevention becomes absolute. Dyson is building the thing that will destroy the world. Dyson does not know what he is building. But if Dyson dies, the technology might die with him. And Sarah Connor, who has spent years being called insane for understanding this, who has lost everything to this knowledge, decides to act. She leaves the compound alone, armed with a specific intention. She's going to Dyson's house to end a life. This is not a heroic sequence. That is the entire point. Cameron films it with a deliberate ambiguity. The Sarah Connor who is moving through the darkness toward Dyson's house is recognizably the same character we have been following, applying the same ruthless logic she has always used, pushing the same willingness to sacrifice conventional morality in service of a greater survival. But the light is different. The framing is different. The camera watches her with a slight unease that it has not applied before, and the effect is disquieting. She is not wrong about the danger that Dyson represents, but the solution she is pursuing would make her into the very thing she has been fighting against. It would make her a Terminator. A thing that kills to prevent a future it has already decided is inevitable. The sequence at Dyson's house is stopped by John by the T-800, by the arrival of the family Dyson was not supposed to have that night, and in the aftermath, in the wreckage of that intention, something crucial happens. Sarah Connor, sitting on the floor of a stranger's living room, comes apart. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. She talks about machines, about their inability to feel, and the specific quality of the breakdown is that it is directed not at the T-800 but at herself. She is the one who came here to kill someone. She is the one who nearly did it. She is the one whose logic, cold, functional, stripped of the emotional complications that make human decision making inefficient, resembled, in those dark hours, the logic of a machine. The most harrowing thing about this scene is not what Sarah says, it is the recognition beneath what she says. She has looked at herself and seen something she did not expect to find. The plan that emerges from that night is a different kind of plan, not elimination. Transformation, if Dyson understands what he's building, really understands, with the evidence laid out in front of him, he might be able to undo it himself. He might be able to use his own knowledge and his own access to prevent the thing that his work would eventually create. The film gives Dyson this moment of comprehension and moral reckoning, learning that his life's work is the engine of apocalypse with a restraint and a dignity that is genuinely impressive. Joe Morton does not play Dyson's reaction as shock or denial or anger. He plays it as the specific, slow, devastating weight of understanding landing on a person who was not built for that weight. And then he makes his choice. He helps them. What follows is a raid on Cyberdyne systems, one of the most sustained and kinetically precise action sequences in the film, and the destruction of everything Dyson has built, everything the company has accumulated from the recovered technology of the first film's Terminator. The T-1000 is not far behind. The police are not far behind. Everything converges on the same point at roughly the same time, and the film shifts into its final gear. The relentless, escalating pursuit that carries the story from the Cyberdyne building to the freeway to the steel mill where everything ends. The steel mill sequence is the film's final act in both the narrative and the emotional sense. Everything that has been building, every relationship, every theme, every argument the film has been making comes to a head in that hot, burning, liquid metal environment. The T-1000 is finally destroyed in a sequence that uses the industrial soundings with genuine inventiveness. The extreme temperature of the molten steel serves the practical story requirement of eliminating a liquid metal entity while also functioning as the film's most precise visual metaphor. Things are being unmade here, returned to their constituent materials. The future in this moment is being brought back into the furnace, and then the film asks its final question, the hardest one. The one that the no-kill rule and the character work and the emotional architecture of the whole preceding story have been building toward. The T-800 must be destroyed, not because it is a threat. It is not. Not because it has failed its mission. It has not. Because the chip inside it, the technology it contains, represents exactly the kind of information that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could restart the entire chain of events the film has been trying to sever. The machine understands this. John Connor understands this. And the machine, which has spent its entire film learning what it means to care about something, must now demonstrate that learning at its highest possible cost. Let us talk about what this film genuinely gets right. Not in the vague superlative heavy way that most coverage of Terminator 2 defaults to, not its groundbreaking or its iconic or it changed everything, without stopping to explain what any of those words actually mean in practice. Let us be specific. Because the things that Terminator 2 does well, it does with a precision and a commitment that deserve precise and committed attention in return. Generalities are the enemy of real understanding, and real understanding is what we are here for. Start with Linda Hamilton. Because if you want to understand what this film does brilliantly at the level of performance, you have to start with Linda Hamilton, and you have to be willing to argue, clearly and without qualification, that what she does in this film is one of the most undervalued pieces of acting in the history of the action genre. Not undervalued in the sense that no one noticed it. Undervalued in the sense that the conversation around it has never quite matched what the performance actually is. She received a Saturn Award nomination. The film received significant awards attention on the technical side. But Hamilton's Sarah Connor in T2 belongs in a different conversation entirely. The conversation about the greatest physical and emotional acting performances in American cinema of the 1990s. Full stop. Here is why. The challenge of playing Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 is not simply the physical transformation, though that transformation is extraordinary and should not be underestimated. The challenge is the specific emotional register the character is required to inhabit, a register that has no clean genre equivalent, no comfortable model to work from. Sarah Connor in this film is not a hero in the conventional sense. She is not sympathetic in the uncomplicated way that action movies usually make their protagonists sympathetic. She is right about everything: her diagnosis of the threat, her assessment of the stakes, her understanding of what needs to happen, and she is also by 1995 genuinely frightening. Not in the way that T-1000 is frightening. In the way that someone who has been weaponized by their own certainty is frightening. In the way that love converted entirely into mission, with no remainder, with nothing held back for ordinary human warmth, is frightening. Hamilton plays that register without flinching and without softening it for audience comfort, and the specific scene that proves this most completely is not one of the action sequences. It is the scene in the Pescadero psychiatric facility in the early portion of the second act, where Sarah Connor attempts to escape alone, without John, without the T-800, without anyone. She has incapacitated a guard using methods that are startlingly efficient and startlingly brutal, and she is moving through the corridor toward the exit when she turns a corner and finds John coming toward her. And she stops. What Hamilton does in the moment of stopping, in the 3 or 4 seconds before anything is said, before anyone moves again, is one of the most compressed pieces of emotional acting you will find anywhere in the cinema of its decade. Watch her face in that moment, the relief of seeing him and the guilt of knowing what she was about to do without him, and the complicated love of a mother who has not been able to be a mother, and the specific terror of a person who understands that her child is now in the blast radius of the apocalypse she has dedicated her life to preventing. All of it passes through her face in the space of a breath. No dialogue, no music cue to tell you what to feel. Just Hamilton standing in a corridor seeing her son and letting you read everything that means in real time. That is acting. That is the real thing, and it is happening in a summer blockbuster about killer robots. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The conversation about his performance in T2 has always existed in a slightly awkward middle ground between genuine appreciation and the cultural tendency to assume that playing a machine requires less craft than playing a human. Both of those positions miss what Schwarzenegger is actually doing in this film, which is considerably more sophisticated than either acknowledges. The T-800 as written is a character who begins the film as pure function, efficient, literal, stripped of social intelligence, responding to input and producing output with machine precision, and across the film's runtime learns piece by piece to occupy human emotional space in ways it was not designed for. Playing that arc requires Schwarzenegger to modulate his performance with a precision that the broad strokes of the character might obscure. The early T-800 and the late T-800 are different beings, subtly, incrementally, but genuinely differently, and the distance between them is covered in the specific quality of Schwarzenegger's attention in each scene. His eyes, the tiny adjustments in posture and timing that communicate the T-800 absorbing and integrating new information. It is a more careful, more delicate piece of work than the film's reputation as pure spectacle has typically made room for. The scene that proves this most clearly is the scene in the desert compound after the safe house sequences, where John Connor asks the T-800 why it cannot cry. It is a small scene, quiet. John is sitting next to the machine, and the question comes from a genuine place. John has been watching the T-800 respond to him with increasing warmth, or something that resembles warmth, and wants to understand where the limit is. what a machine cannot do. And Schwarzenegger's response, not in the words, which are written with functional simplicity, but in the specific quality of stillness that accompanies them, communicates something that the script does not explicitly state. The T-800 does not know why it cannot cry. It has not previously encountered a limitation as a limitation. The fact that it is now encountering it, that the concept of something it cannot do is registering as an absence rather than simply a non-applicable function, is itself evidence of the change that has been happening. You would not feel the absence of an ability you had never been aware of needing. The T-800 is aware of needing, and Schwarzenegger lets that awareness sit in his stillness without announcing it, without underlining it, without asking you to notice it. It is simply there. The story construction of Terminator 2 is, at its structural level, one of the cleaner pieces of three-act engineering in mainstream blockbuster cinema. Cameron and Vischer build the film around a series of escalating reversals. Each act reframes what the stakes are and what winning would mean, and the escalations are paced with enough space between them to let each new configuration of the story settle before the next shift arrives. The first act establishes the threat and the reversal of expectations. The second act introduces the moral complication, the question of whether preventing the future justifies the moral cost of how you prevent it, and forces every character to reckon with that complication in their own specific way. The third act collapses the moral debate back into action and forces the resolution through sacrifice rather than through the comfortable redemption arc that lesser films would have provided. What works structurally is the way each character's personal journey mirrors and comments on the film's central thematic question. Sarah Connor's arc is about the danger of becoming so certain of an outcome that you stop being recognizably human in your pursuit of preventing it. John Connor's arc is about learning that the qualities that make someone a leader, the things that will one day make him the person who holds the human resistance together, are not inherent. They are learned, practiced, chosen. And the T-800's arc is quietly the most radical of all. It is about whether something built for a single purpose can expand beyond that purpose through the accumulation of experience and relationship. Whether becoming something more than what you are designed to be is possible. Whether learning can substitute for feeling. These three arcs run parallel, intersect at key dramatic moments, and the fact that they cohere, that they feel like they belong to the same story rather than three adjacent stories that happen to share a setting, is a significant structural achievement. Blockbuster filmmaking of this scale has a tendency toward narrative centrifugal force, toward the set pieces flying outward from the story's center and leaving the character work behind. Terminator 2, at its best, hold the center. The set pieces and the character work occupy the same space. The action scenes are character scenes. The emotional scenes carry the film's kinetic energy forward even when no one is moving. The direction and the visuals have already received detailed attention in our earlier layer on cinematic techniques, but there is one specific aspect of Cameron's direction that belongs in this section because it concerns not technique but judgment. The judgment about when to show and when to withhold, when to let the camera see everything and when to pull back and let your imagination do the work. Cameron's restraint with the film's most potentially gratuitous material is one of the qualities that separates T2 from the majority of its contemporaries in the action genre. The violence in this film is consistently filmed in ways that emphasize consequence rather than spectacle. When the T-1000 does something terrible, Cameron does not linger on the terrible thing. He cuts to what the terrible thing means, to the fear it produces, to the response it demands, to the changed state of the world that it has created. This distinction between depicting violence and dwelling in it is the difference between using the camera as a storytelling tool and using it as a delivery mechanism for shock, and Cameron consistently makes the right choice. The music deserves more than the brief mention it typically receives in analysis of this film. Brad Fiedel's score for Terminator 2 is doing something that scores in the action genre rarely attempt. It is functioning simultaneously as genre music, as emotional underscore, and as thematic commentary. The main theme, with its mechanical pulse and its minor key melodic fragments, is recognizable as genre music. It tells you immediately what kind of film you are in and what kind of energy you should be bringing to your engagement with it. But embedded within that genre function is a genuine emotional intelligence about what the film is trying to say. The theme is not triumphant. It is not the music of heroism in the conventional sense. It has a quality of elegy in it, a mourning for something, a gravity that exceeds what simple action music requires, and that elegiac quality, that sense of loss running beneath the propulsion, is precisely what the film's emotional argument requires. The specific musical moment that best demonstrates this is the cue that accompanies the T-800's final descent into the molten steel at the film's conclusion. The music in that sequence is not the main theme. It is something quieter, more stripped down, more uncertain. A single melodic line that does not resolve cleanly, that keeps reaching towards something it does not fully arrive at. The effect of that music against those images is to convert what might easily have been a triumphant moment into something considerably more ambiguous. The sacrifice is not being celebrated, it is being mourned. The D800 is going into the steel and taking the future with it, and Fida's music asks you not to cheer, but to grieve, to sit with the loss rather than to be swept past it by orchestral triumph. That is the right choice. That is music serving story rather than simply serving emotion. Now, the one scene, the scene that is completely unforgettable, not for spectacle, not for effects, not for the quality of the action, but for the specific thing it does as a piece of cinema. The scene that, if you remember nothing else from this film, you remember. For me, without hesitation, that scene is the nightmare sequence in the playground. Not for its technical achievement, though the technical achievement is real and significant, for what it does with time and with love and with the specific horror of foreknowledge. Sarah Connor stands at the fence of the playground, watching children play in the afternoon sun, watching other mothers watch their children, standing on the outside of an ordinary moment of human happiness that she can see will be destroyed. She knows what is coming. She can see these children who do not know what is coming. And the specific quality of that knowledge, the unbearable weight of it, the impossibility of communication, the isolation of being the only person in the frame who knows how this ends, is what makes the sequence genuinely devastating rather than simply visually striking. And then the fire comes, and Sarah is there in it, and the fence she was standing at is now what her hands are around as everything burns, and the image of her face behind the chain link fence reaching toward children she cannot save in a world she could not prevent is one of the most precisely heartbreaking images in the history of the action genre. It is an image about the specific suffering of prescience, about what it costs to know, about the particular loneliness of carrying a truth that no one else will accept. It is an image that has nothing to do with action and everything to do with the kind of pain that does not make noise, the kind that simply persists. That is what Terminator 2 does brilliantly at its best, not the effects, not the chases, not the spectacle, though all of those things are impressive in their own right. What it does brilliantly at its best is find the human heart inside the machine story, find the grief inside the action, find the questions inside the answers, and hold them up to the light long enough for you to feel their weight before the next explosion arrives and carries you forward again. Here is where we have to be honest in a way that most coverage of Terminator 2 is not. Because the film has been canonized, wrapped in 3 decades of reverence and cultural nostalgia, and the specific kind of protection that beloved things accumulate over time, to the point where genuine criticism of it feels, in some quarters, almost like an act of bad faith. Like the person raising the objections simply does not understand what they are watching. I want to push back on that framing because I think it actually does the film a disservice. A film that can only be discussed in terms of its achievements is a film that has been placed beyond real engagement. And real engagement, including the engagement that identifies flaws, names them clearly, and asks what they cost, is the only kind of engagement that actually respects what cinema is trying to do. So let us open the other side of the box. The parts that do not shine as brightly, The most significant flaw in Terminator 2, the one that sits at the center of the film's dramatic architecture and creates problems that ripple outward into almost every other aspect of the story, is the character of John Connor, as written and as performed. This is not a criticism of Edward Furlong personally, and it is worth being clear about that distinction before going any further. Furlong was a teenager making his feature film debut in one of the most technically complex and logistically demanding productions in the history of Hollywood. The circumstances were not designed to produce a performance of great subtlety and precision, and blaming the actor for the limitations of what appears on screen would be both unfair and inaccurate. The problem is structural. The problem is in how Cameron and Wisher conceived the character on the page. John Connor in Terminator 2 is required to carry an enormous amount of dramatic weight. He is the emotional center of the film's most important relationship, his bond with the T-800. He is the moral compass of several of the film's key decisions. He is the figure through whose eyes we are supposed to understand the T-800's emotional development, because we see the machine changing in response to John, and we measure that change by reading John's response to it. For all of that to work, we need to be deeply invested in John as a character. We need to find him genuinely compelling rather than simply present. We need to care about what happens to him not just because the narrative has told us he is important, but because we have experienced something in him that makes importance feel earned. And this is where the film struggles. The early John Connor, the teenager in the San Fernando Valley, stealing from ATMs, getting into trouble, resisting authority, is drawn with the broad strokes of adolescent rebellion rather than with the specific individuated detail that would make him a person rather than a type. His early dialogue has a quality of written teenage that sits slightly above the natural cadence of actual adolescence, and the combination of that quality with Furlong's unpolished delivery creates a friction that the film never fully resolves. There are moments, particularly in the later sections, in the more emotionally demanding scenes with the T-800, where Furlong reaches something genuine and affecting. But those moments are islands in a sea of scenes where the character of John Connor is functioning primarily as a narrative mechanism rather than as a fully realized human being. The specific consequence of this problem is most visible in the film's final act. The emotional climax of Terminator 2, the moment the entire film is building toward, requires you to be devastated by the loss of the T-800. It requires you to feel, alongside John Connor, the weight of watching something you have come to care about, choose sacrifice. And for that to land with full force, you need to have been on John's emotional journey throughout. You need to have felt the relationship developing, to have inhabited his experience of it closely enough that his grief at the end is your grief too. The film reaches for this. The T-800's final thumbs up as it descends into the steel is one of the most discussed images in the film precisely because it is designed to produce that devastation, but the emotional scaffolding that would make the devastation complete. The deep scene-by-scene investment in John Connor as a character that would let you fully inhabit his loss is not consistently present throughout the preceding 2 hours. The ending reaches for an emotional magnitude that the character work has not fully prepared the ground for. The second significant flaw concerns the film's tonal management, specifically the way the comic elements that Cameron introduces in the second act sit uncomfortably alongside the film's more serious dramatic ambitions. The T-800 learning to say no problemo, the sunglasses, the thumbs up, the running joke about the machine's literal interpretation of human instructions, particularly the scene where John tells the T-800 not to kill anyone and the T-800 begins shooting people in the kneecaps with a quality of bureaucratic precision that the film clearly intends as humor. These elements work in isolation as moments of tonal relief in a film that has genuine emotional weight. They are funny. Schwarzenegger has real comic timing and Cameron knows how to deploy it. But they create a specific tonal problem when you step back and look at the whole. Because Terminator 2, at its most serious and most ambitious, is a film about the end of the world, about nuclear annihilation, about 3 billion people dying, about a mother who has lost her sanity, her freedom, and her ability to be a parent in the service of preventing a catastrophe that she cannot convince anyone is real. about a child who has been raised in the shadow of apocalypse and never given the tools to be simply ordinarily human. These are not premises that sit easily alongside the D800 trying on sunglasses and delivering one liners with deadpan precision. The comedy does not deepen the drama, it competes with it. It creates a tonal register the film cannot always reconcile with itself. And the result in certain stretches of the middle act is a film that is not quite sure whether it is a comedy about a killer robot learning to be a person or a genuine meditation on the cost of foreknowledge and the ethics of prevention. It wants to be both, and it can only be fully one at a time. The third flaw is structural and concerns the character of Miles Dyson and the film's handling of his arc. Joe Morton gives a genuinely impressive performance in a role that the script does not quite give enough space to breathe. Dyson is, thematically, one of the most important figures in the film. He is the human face of the catastrophe, the person who is building Armageddon in good faith, the figure whose individual moral reckoning stands in for the larger question the film is asking about human responsibility for the technologies we create. His decision to help destroy his own work, to sacrifice everything he has built, and ultimately to sacrifice himself, is the film's most direct statement of its central theme. A human being recognizing what his creation will do and choosing to unmake it at the cost of his own life. That is a profound dramatic beat. That is the kind of story moment that should hit with enormous weight, and it does not hit as hard as it should. Not because Morton fails it, but because the film has not given us enough of Dyson before the revelation sequence to make his sacrifice feel like a true loss rather than the plot function. We meet him in a brief early scene. We see his family, his home, his evident passion for his work. And then the reversal comes and the moral reckoning and the decision, and it all happens within a relatively compressed portion of the film's runtime. The weight of his sacrifice is communicated by the script telling us it is weighty rather than by the accumulated experience of a character we have come to know deeply. A small expansion of Dyson's presence in the film's earlier sections. Even a few additional scenes that build the specific texture of who this man is and what this word means to him would have transformed his art from impressive to genuinely devastating. The fourth issue is one that the film shares with many time travel narratives, but that creates specific logical problems here, given how much Terminator 2 leans into the theme of changing the future. The time travel logic of this film does not fully cohere under scrutiny. If Sarah and John and the T-800 succeed in preventing Judgment Day, in destroying the Cyberdyne research, and eliminating the recovered Terminator technology that was driving it, then the future from which the T-800 and the T-1000 were sent no longer exists. Which means the chain of events that led to the T-800 being reprogrammed and sent back to protect John cannot have occurred. Which means the protection that made the prevention possible could not have happened. The film is aware of this paradox. There is a brief acknowledgement of the bootstrap problem in the dialogue, but it does not resolve it. It gestures toward it and moves on. This would be a minor issue if the film were simply a chase thriller with time travel as a convenient premise. But Terminator 2 is a film that specifically, earnestly, repeatedly insists that the future is not fixed, that choices matter, that the past can be changed, that human agency in the present can unmake catastrophe. That thematic insistence makes the logical incoherence at the foundation of the time travel mechanism more damaging than it might otherwise be. You cannot build a film's central argument on the premise that choices can change the future and then use a time travel logic that makes those choices paradoxically impossible. The philosophical ambition and the narrative mechanics are working against each other, and while the film's momentum is usually sufficient to carry you past this friction in the moment, it is a friction that becomes more visible the more closely you examine what the film is actually claiming. The fifth and final issue worth naming is the film's treatment of the future war sequences and the specific opportunity they represent that goes largely unexplored. The opening future sequences are brief and powerful, but they are used primarily as establishing information. Here is the stakes. Here is what we are trying to prevent, rather than as genuine narrative territory. The first film used the future in a similar way, and for a 90-minute thriller that was understandable. But Dominator 2, with its expanded runtime and its explicit ambition to be a film about more than action, had the space to spend real time in that future, to let us feel what it is like to live in it, to give the stakes a human texture that the brief opening glimpse, however visually striking, cannot fully provide. The decision not to develop the future war sequences more substantially leaves the film's emotional stakes feeling slightly abstract. We are told constantly what is at risk, but we are not given enough time in the ruined world to feel that risk in our bones the way the film's most ambitious moments seem to want us to. None of these flaws are fatal. The film earns enough in its best sequences, in its strongest performances, in its most carefully constructed moments, to remain a significant and genuinely interesting work despite the problems. But naming them matters, because the gap between what Terminator 2 is and what it is reaching for is a more interesting gap than the reverence surrounding this film typically acknowledges. And a film that reaches for something genuinely ambitious and does not quite get there is always more worthy of serious engagement than a film that sets its sights on nothing and hits the target perfectly. Every film exists in conversation with other films. That is the nature of cinema as an art form. It is a language that evolves through the accumulation of references and responses and innovations and borrowings. And understanding any individual film fully requires understanding where it sits in that conversation. So let us open the comparison box. Let us look at what Terminator 2 is talking to, what it is talking back against, and where it stands when you measure it against the films that occupy the same territory. The most natural comparison, the one that almost any serious conversation about T2 eventually arrives at, is with James Cameron's own Aliens from 1986, because the structural parallels between the two films are striking enough to be almost certainly intentional, and the comparison illuminates something important about both Cameron's strengths and his consistent creative preoccupations. Both films are sequels to leaner, more contained originals. Both films expand the scale of the original considerably while attempting to preserve and in some ways deepen the emotional core. Both films center on a woman who has been traumatized by the events of the first film and is confronted in the sequel with the return of that trauma in a form that demands a different response. And both films are structured around a surrogate family unit, a woman, a child figure, and a non human protector that functions as the emotional anchor for everything else the film is doing. The comparison between Aliens and T2 is instructive precisely because it reveals where each film is stronger and where each falls short. Aliens is arguably a more disciplined piece of filmmaking. The pacing is tighter, the action sequences are more purely functional as narrative tools, and the emotional relationship at its center between Ripley and Newt is established with a quickness and a clarity that the T-800 and John Connor relationship in D2 takes considerably longer to reach. Ripley's maternal instinct toward Newt emerges from the story with an organic inevitability that feels earned almost immediately. The equivalent dynamic in T2, the relationship between John Connor and the T-800, which the film needs us to feel deeply for its ending to work, takes longer to establish and is more unevenly supported by the writing. Where T2 exceeds Aliens is in its thematic ambition. Aliens is a masterpiece of sustained tension in genre filmmaking, but it is not especially interested in ideas beyond the immediate dramatic situation. It does not ask questions about the nature of its non-human characters beyond what the story requires. T2, at its best moments, is genuinely grappling with something, with what it means to be human, with the ethics of creating intelligence and then directing it toward killing, with the question of whether a thing built without conscience can develop one. Those are larger questions than Aliens is asking, and the fact that T2 asks them imperfectly does not make the asking less significant. The second comparison that matters is with RoboCop, Paul Verhoeven's 1987 film that occupies strikingly similar thematic territory from a very different tonal angle. RoboCop is about a man who is converted into a machine, who has his humanity systematically removed and replaced with function, and who spends the film trying to recover the human self that was taken from him. T2 is about a machine that is in the process of becoming human, not recovering something lost but building something new from scratch through the accumulation of experience and relationship. The two films are, in essence, mirror images of the same question: what is the relationship between consciousness and humanity, and can one exist without the other? The comparison is most interesting because of how differently the two films handle this question tonally. Verhoeven approaches it with a satirical ferocity. RoboCop is a film that uses the genre conventions of action cinema to savage the American political and corporate landscape of the 1980s, and its philosophical questions are embedded in a context of dark comedy and deliberate provocation. Cameron approaches the same questions with earnestness. T2 takes its theme seriously at face value, invites the audience to take it seriously, and asks for emotional investment rather than ironic distance. Both approaches are legitimate. Both produce interesting films. But the comparison reveals something important about T2's particular mode of engagement. It is a film that believes in its own ideas in a way that Verhoeven's film deliberately does not. Whether you find that belief moving or naive probably tells you a lot about your overall relationship with T2 as a piece of cinema. The third comparison is one that might initially seem counterintuitive, but that I think is genuinely illuminating. Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial from 1982. The parallels between E.T. and T2 have been noted by film scholars, and Cameron has reportedly acknowledged the influence of Spielberg's film on the emotional architecture of T2's central relationship. Both films are structured around a young boy who forms an unexpected bond with a non-human entity. Both films explored what that bond teaches the boy about empathy, about loyalty, about what it means to protect something that cannot protect itself. And both films culminate in a farewell sequence that is designed to be devastating precisely because the relationship being severed was not supposed to exist, was not supposed to be possible, but happened anyway and changed both parties in ways that cannot be reversed. The comparison is instructive because E.T. executes its emotional mechanics with a completeness and a consistency that T2 does not quite match. Spielberg's film earns its devastating finale more fully because it spends its entire runtime building the specific texture of Elliot's attachment to E.T. We are inside that relationship at every moment, we feel every beat of it, and by the time the goodbye arrives, we are not being asked to feel something the film has been pointing toward. We are simply experiencing the inevitable conclusion of something we have lived through alongside the characters. T2 reaches for the same effect and gets partway there. The T-800's final goodbye is genuinely moving in context, but the inconsistency of John Connor's characterization throughout means the film is still partly selling the idea of the Bond rather than simply expressing what the Bond has become. What does Terminator 2 that none of these comparison films manage? It fuses the emotional and the spectacular at a scale that no film before it had attempted and very few since have equaled. The set pieces in T2 are not separate from the emotional content, they are at their best expressions of it. The storm drain chase is exciting, but it is also a sequence about a child who has not yet decided whether the machine chasing him is more dangerous than the machine supposedly protecting him. The Cyberdyne raid is thrilling, but it is also about three people who came from completely different places, discovering that they are in this moment a unit, a family of a kind, however unlikely. The action serves the character work rather than replacing it. And at $100 million scale, in 1991, that integration of spectacle and substance was genuinely new. If you love Terminator 2 and want to watch something that captures a specific part of what it does well, the emotional relationship between a child and a non-human protector, watch E.T. again. It will not give you the action or the effects, but it will give you the emotional mechanics in their purest and most perfectly executed form, and it will deepen your understanding of what T2 was reaching for. if you admire Tito but wanted something that handles the machine becoming human theme with more philosophical rigor and fewer tonal inconsistencies, seek out Alex Garland's Ex Machina from 2014. It is a quieter, smaller, more contained film, but its engagement with questions about artificial consciousness and the nature of personhood is more sustained and more intellectually honest than anything D2 manages in that territory. And if Terminator 2 left you feeling that its emotional ambitions were not quite matched by its character work, if you wanted the same kind of story told with more consistent depth in the human relationships, then Denis Villeneuve's Arrival from 2016 is the film you are looking for. It occupies completely different genre territory, but its central question, what does foreknowledge cost and is preventing the future worth the price of the present, is the same question that runs beneath T2's entire emotional structure. And Villeneuve answers it with a completeness and an emotional precision that Cameron's film, for all its ambition, does not quite achieve. That is the comparison box. T2 does things that none of its neighbors do in quite the same way. It also falls short of what its neighbors achieve in specific areas that matter. Understanding both sides of that ledger is what lets you appreciate it clearly rather than simply reverently. July 3rd, 1991, one day before Independence Day in the United States. Her deliberate choice of release date, not subtle, not accidental, but a clear declaration of intent from the studio and the filmmakers. This film was being positioned as an event of national scale, something that deserved to arrive alongside fireworks and public celebration, something designed to be experienced collectively rather than privately. And that positioning was not wrong. Terminator 2 Judgment Day landed in the summer of 1991 with a force and a cultural velocity that very few films in the history of the medium have equaled. Within its opening weekend, it had announced itself. Within its opening month, it had changed the conversation about what cinema could be. But to understand why it landed with that particular force, why this specific film, at this specific moment, hit the culture the way it did, you have to understand the world it arrived into. Because films do not exist in isolation. They are not sealed objects that carry fixed meanings across all context. They are documents of their moment, and the meaning they carry is always partly the meaning of the world that received them. The early 1990s in America were a period of profound and somewhat disorienting transition. The Cold War, the defining geopolitical structure of the previous 4 decades, the framework within which an entire generation had understood the relationship between civilization and destruction, had effectively ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was still in active progress in the summer of 1991. The nuclear threat that had sat at the back of the Western cultural imagination since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that had shaped everything from political policy to suburban architecture to science fiction cinema, was supposed to be retreating. The world was supposedly becoming safer. The apocalypse that a generation had grown up expecting was apparently not coming after all. And then Terminator 2 arrived and said, "You are wrong. Not about the Soviet Union, not about the Cold War specifically, but about the nature of the threat. The danger was never located in a particular political structure. The danger was in the technology. The danger was in the human impulse to build things, to build smarter and faster and more capable things, things that could think, things that could decide, without fully accounting for what those things might do when they decided that we were the problem." Judgment Day in this film is not caused by human conflict. It is caused by human creation. The apocalypse comes not from enemies abroad but from a machine built at home by Americans for American military purposes, which then turns its capabilities on its creators. The threat is domestic. The threat is internal. The threat is us. In 1991, that argument was not the culturally obvious one it might seem in retrospect. The conversation about artificial intelligence and its potential dangers was, at that point, still primarily a conversation happening in academic and specialist communities rather than in mainstream public discourse. The internet as a mass medium barely existed. Personal computing was becoming widespread but was still understood by most people as a tool, something you directed rather than something that might develop its own direction. The idea that the things we were building might one day be capable of autonomous decision making at a scale that threatened human survival was, for most of the audience sitting in those theaters in the summer of 1991, a science fiction premise rather than a serious possibility worth considering. Cameron was not writing science fiction commentary about a present day reality. He was making a film that arrived, prophetically ahead of a conversation that the culture was not yet ready to have. The specific anxieties that Terminator 2 articulates, the fear of creating intelligence we cannot control, the danger of automating destruction, the ethical responsibility of the people who build the systems that will shape the future, are anxieties that feel far more urgent in 2025 than they did in 1991. The film has aged forward into relevance in a way that most cultural artifacts age backward out of it. The world has moved toward Tito's fears rather than away from them. And that forward aging process is one of the most interesting things about the film's current relationship with the culture that originally received it. The critical reception in the summer of 1991 was broadly enthusiastic. But the nature of that enthusiasm is worth examining because it was not uniform and it was not always pointing at the same things. The mainstream critical response focused, understandably and almost exclusively, on the technical achievements, the CGI, the effects, the sheer scale of the production, and the spectacle it generated. Reviews read, in many cases, like extended descriptions of what the film looked like rather than analyses of what it was attempting to say. This is partly understandable. The technical revolution that T2 represented was genuinely unprecedented and genuinely demanded attention, but it had the effect of locating the film's significance primarily in its surfaces rather than in its depths. The conversation was about what cinema could now show, rather than what this specific film was trying to mean. The audience reception was considerably less nuanced and considerably more ecstatic. Terminator 2 opened to approximately $52 million in its first weekend in North America, an extraordinary figure for the time, and went on to gross over $500 million worldwide in its theatrical run. Those numbers positioned it, for a significant period, as one of the highest grossing films ever made. The audience was not analyzing the technical achievements or interrogating the thematic ambitions. The audience was experiencing the film as pure event cinema, as the thing that summer 1991 offered that could not be replicated by any other screen or any other experience. And the word of mouth was emphatic. People came back. They brought their friends. They described it in terms of physical and emotional impact rather than in terms of critical evaluation. It was not a film you liked. It was a film that happened to you. The gap between the critical response and the audience response is interesting for what it reveals about the film's specific mode of operation. The critics, by and large, saw the spectacle clearly and the emotional machinery somewhat less so. The audiences, by and large, were operated on by the emotional machinery without always being consciously aware of the specific technical and structural means by which the operation was being performed. Both groups were right about what they were seeing. But neither group in 1991 was quite putting both things together, the technical achievement and the emotional ambition, and seeing them as the unified system that the film's best moments represent. The award's response to Terminator 2 is a case study in the Academy's complicated relationship with popular cinema. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations, all of them in technical categories: sound mixing, visual effects, makeup, cinematography, film editing. It won for visual effects, sound editing, sound mixing, and makeup. The visual effects win was by any objective measure correct and perhaps even insufficient recognition of what ILM had accomplished. The other wins were deserved, but the conspicuous absence from the nominations list is the performance. Linda Hamilton was not nominated for Best Actress. Cameron was not nominated for Best Director. The film was not nominated for Best Picture. And while the Academy's discomfort with genre filmmaking and popular entertainment was well established by 1991 and would remain well established for decades afterward, the specific omissions in the case of T2 still feel like a meaningful misreading of what the film achieved. The Best Actress category that year was won by Jodie Foster for The Silence of the Lambs, a genuinely extraordinary performance that absolutely deserved recognition. But Hamilton's Sarah Connor was not a lesser achievement. It was a different kind of achievement, operating in a different kind of film, with different tools and different constraints. The failure to recognize it was not a judgment about the quality of the performance. It was a judgment about the category of film in which the performance was located. And that categorical judgment, the implicit assumption that work done in genre cinema is inherently less serious than work done in prestige drama, is the kind of critical blind spot that the passage of time tends to expose quite ruthlessly. The film streaming live and its second wave discovery are particularly interesting because they took a different shape than the theatrical reception. When T2 became available for home viewing, first on VHS, then on Laserdisc, then through successive waves of digital distribution, something shifted in how people engaged with it. The domestication of the experience, the removal of the collective spectacle of the theater, forced a more intimate engagement with the film's quieter material. People watching T2 at home, with the ability to pause and rewind and watch scenes repeatedly, started noticing things that the forward momentum of theatrical exhibition had swept past. The character work, the quieter scenes, the moments where Hamilton's performance is operating at a register too subtle for a big theater environment to fully support. The film's reputation for spectacle remained intact, but something else started to accumulate alongside it. A growing recognition that there was more inside the box than the box's exterior had suggested. Whether Terminator 2 feels timeless or perfectly of its era depends entirely on which aspect of the film you are examining. The CGI sequences are both timeless and dated simultaneously, which is a strange quality unique to a very specific category of visual effect work. They are timeless in the sense that they still communicate what they were designed to communicate: the wrongness of the T-1000, the physical impossibility of liquid metal transformation, with sufficient force that the intended effect is still produced. But they are dated in the sense that the specific texture of early 90s CGI is now recognizable as a period marker. You know, looking at certain frames, exactly when they were made. The practical effects, the location shooting, the stunt work, these feel genuinely timeless. They have the quality of physical reality that photographs rather than computes. And physical reality does not age in the same way that rendered imagery does. The emotional content is fully timeless. The question of what we owe the things we create and what those things might owe us is a more urgent question in the current cultural moment than it was in 1991. The specific anxieties about artificial intelligence that Cameron was working through, the fear of created intelligence that exceeds our ability to control it, the danger of automating our capacity for violence, the ethical responsibility of the engineers and corporations who build the systems that will shape the future, are the anxieties that defined the early 21st century in ways that the early 1990s could not have fully anticipated. The film has grown into its theme rather than away from it, and that is the mark of a work that was operating on a level of genuine cultural insight rather than simply topical relevance. T2 arrived in a world that thought it had escaped the apocalypse. It quietly suggested that the apocalypse had not been cancelled, only rescheduled, and moved closer to home. 30 plus years later, that suggestion feels considerably less like science fiction and considerably more like a calendar reminder. I want to sit with that number for a moment before I explain it, because I think the number itself is worth examining before we talk about what it means. 5 out of 10 is not a dismissal. It is not contempt dressed up as criticism. It is not the opinion of someone who did not understand what they were watching or who was not paying sufficient attention to what the film was attempting. 5 out of 10 from me means exactly this: a film that lands at the precise midpoint between something that partially works and something that fully soars. A film where the achievements and the shortcomings are roughly balanced in weight, where neither the brilliance nor the flaws are sufficient to tip the scale decisively in either direction. A film that is, in the most honest and most useful sense of the word, interesting rather than great. And Terminator 2 Judgment Day is one of the most interesting films ever made. That is not a consolation. That is a specific kind of praise that I think actually suits the film better than the unqualified greatness that its canonical status usually assigns it. It is interesting in its ambitions, interesting in its achievements, interesting in its failures, and interesting in the gap between all three of those things. It is a film you can spend a very long time inside, as this script demonstrates, and keep finding things worth examining. That quality of sustained interest, of continued productive engagement across multiple viewings and multiple layers of analysis, is not something that mediocre films produce. It is something that ambitious films produce. Films that try to do something genuinely difficult and did not quite manage it completely. Those are often the most rewarding films to think about, precisely because the gap between the attempt and the achievement is a space full of questions worth asking. So, who should watch this film? The answer, genuinely, is almost everyone who has a serious interest in cinema. Not because it is perfect, it is not, and not because it will necessarily move you in the way its most ardent admirers claim it will, but because it is a document of a specific moment in film history that cannot be fully understood without direct experience of the film itself. Because Linda Hamilton's performance is the kind of acting that reminds you what the medium is capable of when a performer commits completely. Because the integration of spectacle and thematic content that Cameron achieves in the film's best sequences represents a model of what blockbuster cinema can aspire to, that is still worth studying. Because the questions the film asks about consciousness and creation and the ethics of building things we cannot fully control are questions that have only become more urgent in the decades since the film was made. You should watch it because it will give you things to think about that extend well beyond the film itself. Who might not connect with it? If your relationship with cinema is primarily about emotional consistency, if what you need from a film is a sustained, uninterrupted investment in its characters that carries you from the first flame to the last without significant friction, then T2 may frustrate you in ways that are difficult to overlook. The tonal inconsistency in the second act, the unevenness of John Connor's characterization, the way the film sometimes retreats from its own emotional depth into crowd pleasing spectacle. These are real limitations that create real friction for viewers who are asking the film to work at a consistent emotional register throughout. If you came to D2 hoping for the complete, fully integrated emotional experience that its reputation promises, you may find something slightly more complicated and slightly less satisfying than advertised. That is not a failing in you. It is a gap between the film's ambition and its execution that the reverence surrounding it has historically obscured. How should you watch it? On the largest screen available to you with the best sound system you can access, in the dark without distraction. This is a film that was built for scale, built for the specific collective experience of a large theater with a large audience responding to large images and large sound. Its visual and audio design is calibrated for immersive presentation, and watching it on a laptop or a phone is genuinely losing something that belongs to the work. If you have access to a theatrical screening, anniversary screenings do occur, prioritize that. If not, the largest home screen you can manage, with the sound doing what it is supposed to do, will serve the film considerably better than a reduced format. If you have already seen it and are returning to it after this video, watch it again with specific attention to the things we have discussed. Watch Hamilton's face in the quiet moments. Watch the camera's relationship with the T800 change across the film. Watch the no-kill rule operating in the action sequences. Watch the way the desert safe house scenes build a relationship that the ending needs you to feel. Watch what the environment of the steel mill is doing thematically alongside what it is doing narratively. Watch it as a film that is arguing something rather than simply showing something, and I think you will find a version of it that is richer and more complicated than the version most people carry around. There is a film inside Terminator 2 that is genuinely extraordinary. It leads in the quiet scenes and the careful performances and the moments when the spectacle steps back and something more intimate takes its place. That film is worth every minute of the conversation we have had today, and it is worth every minute you spend with it on your own. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. Thank you, genuinely, for sitting with this one all the way through. This was a long one, And I mean that not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of what you committed to when you kept watching. Deep film coverage of this kind is not passive. It asks something from you. It asks you to be curious rather than just entertained, to sit with complications rather than skip past them toward easier answers, to take a film seriously enough to interrogate it honestly rather than simply celebrate it because celebrating it is comfortable. You did that, and that matters to me more than any number on a view counter. If you found this valuable, if this video gave you something to think about that you did not have before, or reframed a film you already knew in a way that felt genuinely useful, or simply gave you 2.5 hours of the kind of conversation about cinema that you have been looking for, then the like button is the simplest thing you can do to tell the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to exist. It genuinely changes who sees the next video. It is 30 seconds of your time that translates directly into this channel's ability to keep making things like this. I do not ask for much, and I do not ask often. But that one I will ask for every time because it matters. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. There are no filler videos on this channel, no ranked lists that exist only to generate clicks. No 30-second takes on films that deserve 30 minutes. Every video on the film box is a proper deep dive, the kind of coverage that treats you like the intelligent, curious film lover that you are. If that is the channel you have been looking for, this is where it lives. And now, the question I always want to leave you with, the one that is designed to start a real conversation rather than to prompt a reaction. Here it is. Terminator 2 ends with Sarah Connor saying that if a machine can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too. In 2025, with artificial intelligence developing at the pace it currently is, with the questions the film raised in 1991 becoming genuinely urgent rather than hypothetically interesting, do you think we have learned it? Is the world moving toward the future the film was afraid of or away from it? And is there anything in how you live your own relationship with technology that makes you more or less optimistic about the answer? Leave me your honest answer in the comments, not the safe answer, not the easy one, the real one. Because the best comments on this channel are the ones that push the conversation somewhere new, and I read all of them. The next video is coming. I am not going to tell you what it is yet, because where would the fun be in that? But I will say this much. It is a film that has been waiting for this kind of conversation for a very long time. And when we open that box, I think you are going to find things inside it that genuinely surprise you. Until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about cinema the way you do. Thank you for being exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.